So the first part of our project, we want to be able to load a word list and dynamically load it from any Google Sheet. So going through the Google Sheet, I've got one here with the word list, and it's just going to be taking the values from the first column. Even if you have spaces, we've got a way to debug and to avoid any of the spaces. But by default, most of your lists, the word lists that you want to use for this project, they should not have spaces in general. So once you create your sheet, go ahead and share the sheet, so publish to the web. And once it's published to the web, you can grab the ID of the sheet and go into the project and paste the ID. And that will load the word list from the sheet. And even if you were to create a brand new sheet, so let's create another spreadsheet. And let's create some words. Go ahead and publish this one. So we're just publishing the sheet as a web page. And that's going to allow us to share via the ID. So now we can select the ID, add it into the application, and that's going to load the new word list of content, taking the content from the first row and first column and outputting it into a word list. And at this point, then we can use the array within our application. So this provides users a way to load their own word lists into your application. And that's the project that we're going to be creating. So let's get started. So we want to be able to load a list of words dynamically that are, or phrases that are coming from a Google Sheet. So allowing the user either to select our default list or go over and share their sheet and load their sheet data into our JavaScript application for the word scramble. So going over to the Google, and you need to have a Google account for this. So go ahead and log into your Google account. Go to drive.google.com/drive/my drive. And from there you can create a new Google Sheet. So create the sheet and give the sheet a name. So whatever name that you want to use. I'm going to just create it as word list. And then within the sheet, so just using whatever the first sheet is, you can name it or you can just leave it just as its default of sheet. I usually like to bold the first row, as this is going to be used for the header when we share the sheet information. So JavaScript project, and then enter in some phrases that you want to use. So HTML, and let's do one more. So that's going to give us a list of 5 possible phrases that we can use within our application. So we want to have the option to be able to load that just by using the ID from the sheet and load the content dynamically into the application. So let's go ahead and do a file and publish to the web. So under the file option, publish to the web, and this will actually share our sheet. And you can find out more about it at support.google.com/docs. So more information about publishing the file and how that works. And you can select either the entire document or the sheet. So in this case, we're just going to use the first sheet. Select publish and hit OK. And what this is going to do is it's going to give you a web URL. You're welcome to try the web URL, to copy the web URL and try it within the browser. So that lists out the contents of your sheet. And we are going to be using the JSON content. We can also do a comma separated of the values and copy that and paste that in. And what that will do is that will allow us to provide a link to download it as a CSV. So that's not exactly what we want, because we want to be able to access it via the web. And the same thing for the PDF for the tab separated values. So we want to actually have it as a web page, and that's why we're sharing it as a web page. So save that, and once you've got it shared to the web, just make sure that it is published, that you do have an active web URL that you can access it with. And then go back into the Google Sheet and copy out in the URL of the sheet up at the top. So for where it says docs.google.com/spreadsheets/D, and then this ID number. So grab that ID number from the sheet, open up your editor, and I've just got a new JS file. We've called it Pro3, and it just got a basic JavaScript shell. So let's add that ID value into the sheet. So without the slash, just the characters. And I'm going to do a code wrap so that we can see all of the code. So once we have the ID, we're ready to make our fetch connection to connect to the Google ID and get the sheet data. So the URL that we're going to use, it's going to be /spreadsheets.google.com/feeds/list, and then using that ID and /1/public values, and then alt is JSON. So this way, this will create a web URL that we can use in order to make the fetch request and return back the content. So for now, let's output the web URL into the project. And we can minimize this. So if we click this link, it's going to bring us over to where we've got the sheets. And now we just want to extract out the rows of content so that we can use this content within our web project. And if you want, you can also copy and paste this into a lint program. So we got the JSON lint. And within the validator, it's going to make the JSON object a lot more readable so that you can go through and you can easily pick out the contents that you want to use. So we do have the total results. So we've got the total results of 5. So we do have some information there that we can use. And within each one of them, we've got value. So we've got the title. And under the title, we've got type, text, and the text content that we want to use. So now it's up to us to make a fetch request and loop through all of the results, so all of the entry items that we have within the feed, and output the content into an array that we can then use within our JavaScript. So it's within the entry object. So let's create our fetch request and adding in a button on the page. And we'll also create an input. And actually, we're going to do this all with JavaScript so that we get some good JavaScript practice. So let's create the button using the document, create elements, and the element that we want to create is going to be a button. And then within the button, add in some text content. And you can say load sheet by ID. And also we need to have an input area. And I'll just call that sheet ID. So using the document, create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be an input. And for the sheet ID, let's set an attribute, and the attribute is going to be a text type for the input. So just adding that in. And then we also want to add it to the page. So we can add it in, we can create a basic container to add the content into. I'll give it a name of output. And we can select that with the JavaScript and then add our newly created elements into that. So using document and query selector, let's select the element with a class of output. And then now let's put it all together where we're going to add to output. And first we'll append the sheet ID object, so that's just that input field. And then also to output, let's append the button. So that gives us an option to add in the ID, load sheet by ID. And now let's add an event listener. So add event listener to the button click. And so whenever the button gets clicked, we're creating the interaction for loading the content. And we want to make our fetch request here. So for right now, let's just do a quick console message. and we'll get the content of sheet ID, so whatever the value is, and we'll output that into the console. So whatever that value is, and this should be the sheet ID that we want to make the request to. And by default, what I'll do is I'll add in our default sheet as the value for an example. So let's take the sheet ID and set its value, and its value is going to be equal to ID. Also, let's apply a little bit of styling to the input, as so we've got a longer width of 100%, and we'll do a display, and not inline, we'll do a display block so it gets its own line, and maybe we only want to do about 80%. And also to center it, we can do a center auto. And also for the button, let's do the same thing. And we can actually take the button object and apply the same styling properties to it. So that way that gets centered, and we have an option to load the sheet ID. And I just want to make sure that we can see the full content. And for the input itself, I'm going to update the font size. So I'm going to make the font size fairly small. And actually even smaller than that. So that depending on whatever size screen they have, that we make sure the font size fits in there. And also we can do a text align, and we can center align the text. So that's when it's pasted, it's nice and neat within the input field. So let's go back to our sheet, and when we click the button, we're outputting the sheet content. So that means that we're ready to make our fetch request. So let's do that here as well. We're going to make the fetch request. So using fetch, and we actually want to update whatever the URL is at this point. So we can set up the URL within the event, and that way we're going to get whatever the fresh sheet ID value is. And that will build the URL that we can make the fetch request to. So that builds the URL there. So using fetch to the URL, let's make then, and we'll make a request and return back the request as JSON object. And let me separate these. And the next promise is going to get back the data. So this should get back the JSON data, and then output that into the console. And we should also disable the ability to click the button. So take the button and set the disabled to be true. So that way, once we click it, we can't keep clicking the button. And we want to load the feed content and the different entries within the feed content. So we want to load that into an object that we can loop through. So JSON feed, and this is also a good use for the console log so that you can see. So either way, if you're going to the JSON lint or if you're just outputting it into the console, you can quite easily get through and get to the content that you want within these complex objects. And the one that we do want is going to be an array, and you'll see that this one has the length there, so it's got a length of 5. So we want to get the entry object. So load to sheets, and that gives us the array. And now it's just a matter of going through the array and getting back the $$ word. So that's going to be the value that we want to pull back. And we actually just want to get whatever the first value here is. So looking through the different options that we have here. And we can also get the title value as well. So within the title object, we can get the $T. And that's treating this as a title. So if we had separate values here within the sheet, and let's just double check to make sure that that's still going to be a title. and it's still getting back the first column of words. So that's another option as well, that you can get the title object. So we can loop through and return back the title object, and that will allow us to pick up the first column within the row and quite easily return back the data. So let's do that as well. We'll create our temp array, and that can just be whatever the temporary that we want to use. So we've got a few options there, and actually this is going to be the one that we're going to use within the live data. So we can have a bunch of words here already. So this can serve as a default. So just hello world and JavaScript code. So we can have that as our default array. And if we do successfully make the request and we return back data, then we can populate out and we can clear out the my words and set the length to 0. And then we can update the contents of it as we loop through the entries. So let's do that as well. And I'll just shorten that so it's a little bit shorter there. And then we'll take the NT array. And one of the things with the arrays is that when you reassign it, it's still pointing to the same array. So even though that we've assigned NT to the array, it's just allowing us to shorten the value. And we could just as easily copy and paste this and do it this way as well. So either way works fine. I usually do like to shorten it so it's a little bit easier to read and to loop through. But you can just keep all of the property values within the dot notation as well. And there's also the option to go with the bracket notation. So either way, you're going to be returning back the same object value. So you could change this to feed and also do the entry to feed. So this is optional depending on how you want to return back the content. Either one is going to return it back the same way. So once we loop through them, we'll console log out the element. And let's just take a look at what we want to get. So we're just going for the first column, which is also title. And it's got the $T. So add that into the bracket notation and $T, and that will return back the text content. So it returns back all of the rows of content. So even if we were to add more rows, and let's refresh, that's going to add all of that in. So that's going to make it really easy to push the content into the my words array and give us a dynamic list of words that we can use. So selecting that element object, and we'll push it in. And we also want to check to make sure that the length of this is greater than 0 before we add it into the array. If it's not greater than 0, then we just want to skip it. So that's in case we've got something like this where we've got an extra empty row and we load that. And if you do have a space, what's happened here is that it's only going to return back the content up until you have a space. So also keep that in mind. But if you do have a value in that row, then you will get everything in. And here it's just going to type in row number 5 for the title. So it's going to add in a default value. It's not just going to be blank. So that's something to keep in mind. You can as well get the JSX word value, and that will just pull that first JSX word value out. So that's the other option that you have. So instead of going with the title, and let's create a temporary element. So getting the element and the JSX word. And I'll just keep it within the bracket notation. And then the T value. And then here we'll make sure that it's larger, and then we'll push that into the my words array. And then lastly, what we'll do is we'll log out what we've got for my words. So let's try that one more time. So that gave us a list of the words, and this way we avoided that where it says the row 5. So it just took the words, and even though that we had a blank space there, it just took the words. And this is actually going to be dependent on what the first column is. So depending on what the first column heading is, it's going to change. So if I change this to word 1, it's actually not going to find anything for that. So you have to be mindful of the fact that it's not going to be able to find anything for that. So there's going to be nothing under word 1. So that one is a little bit more structured, that if you do it that way, you do need to set and make sure that you need to be structured and make sure that your headings are matching that. So in a way, it's easier to just go with the title. But again, this is up to you how you want to handle that. And I'll just output both versions here within the example. So we'll grab the title, and we can check to see if the title, and this way it's going to load in, unfortunately, the row 5. So we can check to make sure that there's no colon in the word. So we'll have another condition here, and within the console log, we do have quite a few string methods that we can work with. So let's check to see if temp includes, and this is a built-in method, so we're just looking to see if it includes the colon. So it's going to return back a Boolean value, whether it includes it or not. And in this case, it finds it as true. So we can check to make sure that it's greater than 0 and that it doesn't include the colon. And that's another way that we can clean up the list that we're constructing. So that way we're not forced to use whatever the first column heading is. And it creates a more dynamic way to load the content. So now they just need to add in the ID. Also within the fetch request, we're going to add in a catch, and the catch can serve as, if we have any errors with the fetch request, we can catch the errors. So within the fetch request, and this will, if we have any errors, it will catch the error. And it's not going to change the my words length, and it will output into the console. And we need to have this as an arrow format as a function. So if by chance the user puts in an invalid ID, so if their ID is not valid, it's just going to say the list not loaded. So throw an error, but it'll continue to allow us to run the application. So also let's output the list contents to the page so that before we begin the game, the user can see the list contents. So as we're loading the list of items and we're looping through the entries, we'll create another element, and this can just be a div. So document create element, and this is going to be where either we're going to load the list or we're going to have our message. So within output append div, and then now within the div object, let's update the text content, and it'll say list not loaded. Using default list. And what this will also do is once we press it, and once either we've loaded it, and we can also provide an option to re-click the button. And then after we load, we can also provide an option to re-click the button for the list. And then as we loop through, we're going to append the word to the list. So let's create a span and document, create elements, and the element that we're going to create is going to be a span. And then this span we're just going to be appending to div the span. And this one we're actually only going to have to if we have a valid word. So let's add that into this condition. And then within the span, let's add in the text content, and we're going to equal the text content to whatever the word is. And then we'll just put a space there. So when we load the sheet data, we get the content being output there. And also, maybe we want to wrap around it. Or either that, or we could comma separate out the list. So let's take the span out here. And we'll add the span over here. And then for the span content, let's take the contents of my words and use join in order to join them together. And we also have an option to separate it out with a comma. So let's see what that looks like. So that will load the content. And I'll actually add in a space as well, so it's easier to read. So there's our word list that we're going to be using, and then that's coming from the sheet. So that's how you can let the user make a selection, or either they're just going to be able to use the default word list. And we can as well output that value like this. So either way, it's going to load the word list. So in this case, it's actually loading the default word list. So we need to move it back in to the function, and then we can also have it within here. So if we catch it, if there is an error. So if there is an error, it's just going to use the default word list. And we need to separate it out. So what it had done, it had already loaded the word list. So this is also a way that if you want to have multiple word lists, you can just load in more word lists as needed. And it's just going to continue to add in the spans. So now that we've got the word list dynamically generating, we're ready to move on to the next part. The task for this lesson is to log into your Google account, create a sheet, publish it as a web page, and then connect to it with the fetch request from your application. So using the JSON and returning back the JSON data from the sheet, create the elements for the page in order to do the button request and also an input where the user can add their sheet ID, and then generate an array of words from the first column of data and create that within the array of your JavaScript code so that it's ready to use for your application. And this is going to provide a way for the user to be able to play a game, load some content that they want from their own Google Sheet list.